Hi, everyone, and welcome to our presentation, Uniting Communities for Environmental Justice, Radioactive Pollution Deadly in Any Space. So my name is Robin Lloyd. I'm co-chair of US WILPF Disarm, and we have a great graphic that is meant to be playing here that you'll see in a few moments uh, that shows our issue, which is what to do with radioactive waste. And I just want to say a comment about the two presentations that are preceding us. To my mind, they illustrate the power of WILPF and the involvement of WILPF in the Midwest, where these issues are so paramount. And it's so heartening to see the commitment to these issues of water and good food. So we are looking here with another big problem, which, um, of course, I feel as Disarm chair is really paramount. And that is when we think about nuclear weapons and nuclear waste, we sometimes forget that their existence is based on one unstable metal, uranium. And uranium, think about it. It has changed not only how war is fought these days or not fought, but it has changed our foreign policy, our health concerns, and how we look at climate change. The discovery, refinement, and weaponing of this unstable metal has not only changed society, it has empowered mainly men to use it to build state power as tools of dominance and control, becoming in a way a symbol of masculine strength. WILPF's International Director of Disarmament at the UN, Ray Atchison, has eloquently developed this connection. Women have long been saying that the emperor wears no clothes, that the glamorous use of uranium for power or for weapons ignores its side effects as a cause of cancer, birth defects, and other genetic damage. And of course, because of its end use as radioactive waste, which is piling up in communities around the country. That this problem is overlooked by politicians and usually the general public is a crisis that must be resolved. So most of you on this call probably know that WILPF's position is that no more nuclear waste should be created and that what exists should be stored near where it was created. But how safe is it there? And what are the ongoing impacts of this, called by some poison fire, of this King Midas greed for more of the magic uranium, which is not actually a blessing, but a curse. So in this hour, we will be talking with some of the amazing activist caregivers who have devoted their lives to raising the alarm about nuclear weapons and radiation. But before our panelists speak, I'd like to start with one of our foremothers, Rosalie Bertel, whose work deeply affected me. Rosalie was a Canadian nun scientist. I met her in Hiroshima on the 40th anniversary of the dropping of the bomb. We were there as part of a delegation for the ANH bomb conference. And one day we visited the atomic hospital in Hiroshima. I watched as she sought to rebut the pro-nuclear Japanese officials who claim that there are no harmful effects from low-level radiation from nuclear facilities. That doctors, especially Japanese doctors, were willing to justify further experiments with nuclear power was very depressing to our delegation. Rosalie's book, No Immediate Danger, came out the next year. The True Facts of Nuclear Technology and its lethal and terminal impact on all life on Earth is its theme. Her groundbreaking work was followed by physicist Alice Stewart, warning of the danger of even low-level radiation doses for such groups as pregnant women and nuclear workers. So, and now we have Mary Olson. Biologist Mary Olson is clear that her life's mission is to bring to light the disproportionate impact of radiation on girls and women. She wants to retire what's called radiation man, no, reference man. Reference man is a so-called person with the anatomical and physiological characteristics of an average individual that is used in calculations assessing internal or external doses of radiation. So she has found and she has studied that these assumptions are skewed in terms of how it analyzes the harm to girls and boys. She's not joining us today, but in the chat, you can find a link to her paper, Atomic Radiation is More Harmful to Women. This study was influential at the Vienna Conference on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons, which led to the passage of the Treaty on the Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in 2017, which I'm sure you all know about. It was passed, and now 55 states around the world have ratified it. So now I'd like to introduce Tina Cordova, who is from New Mexico. Some WILPF members may remember when she spoke to us last summer at the 75th anniversary of the Trinity bomb. Her moving description of the thousands of farm families living off the land in the enlarged radius of the explosion of the first nuclear weapon on July 16th, 1945, and how cancer has tracked those families through the generations was very moving last year. She will tell us now more about the effect to gain recompense from the federal RECA Act, it's called, I guess, Radioactive Exposure Comprehension Bill. So here is Tina. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody from beautiful New Mexico, where we have pristine forests and beautiful deserts. I co-founded the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium 16 years ago to bring attention to the negative health effects suffered by the people of New Mexico as a result of their overexposure to radiation from the Trinity Test site. The Trinity Test took place July 16th, 1945, 76 years ago now, in the desert of South Central New Mexico. And the government has controlled the messaging around this since the beginning of the test. And what they've always said is that the area was remote and uninhabited, and no one lived here and no one was harmed. And we're here, the TBDC and our members, to stand up and say, absolutely not true, absolutely false. Because of a very, very brilliant student at the University of New Mexico, we now have proof positive of this. I speak in classes at the University of New Mexico every year, and I always appeal to the students there to help us with special projects. And this past year, I finally got a student to bite on the idea of building or constructing what we call the Trinity 150-mile radius map. And what this brilliant student did was he took the 1940 census data, and then he took a map of New Mexico with the census tracts associated with it and drew incremental radiuses around Trinity to 150 miles. Why 150 miles? Because after the test was complete, Dr. Hempelman, who was a physician assigned to the test, wrote a memo to General Groves that has since been declassified that said something to the effect of, we can never do this here again because we so overexpose people to radiation. And if we ever do it any place, we have to have a 150-mile radius uninhabited. Well, at 10 miles, there was no one living next to Trinity, and we knew that because the first families we found lived about 12 miles from the Trinity test site. But if you get to the 50-mile radius, there were close to 15,000 men, women, and children living adjacent to the test site. And at 150 miles, it encompassed Albuquerque and Santa Fe to the north, El Paso and Ciudad Juarez to the south. It encompassed the Arizona-New Mexico border to the west, and it almost reached the Texas border to the east. It was essentially our entire state, and there were 500,000 people living within that 150-mile radius. So please never believe that this area was remote and uninhabited in 1945 and that no one lived here and no one was harmed. To give you a little bit of an understanding of why all of this is important, we first have to reflect on a few things that are relative to Trinity. First of all, because it was the first test, there were things that were unknown, and then there were things that were known. The things that were known are the most important things, and those are that radiation did cause negative health effects. That was very well known in 1945. There were already tests being done. There were already scientists and doctors working on this, and they knew that exposure to radiation caused health problems. They also knew that people lived far too close to Trinity to safely detonate the bomb. They knew that. They knew that the weather was not the best for detonating a bomb of this type. And they were taking bets, actually, on the night of the test that they would ignite the atmosphere. What they didn't know, though, and this is very critical, is exactly how much plutonium would be necessary to cause the bomb to actually detonate. And so it was very inefficient. They overpacked the bomb with 13 pounds of weapons-grade plutonium that has a half-life of 24,000 years, and they only needed 3 pounds of plutonium. What that means is a full 10 pounds of plutonium went up in the fireball that exceeded the atmosphere and penetrated the stratosphere, and then rained down a radioactive ash for days on all the communities surrounding Trinity. That radioactive ash went over 7 miles into the sky. The fireball, and this is another thing they didn't know that detonating a bomb on a platform 100 feet off the ground would cause this massive explosion and blast that came down, intercepted the earth, took up dirt, sand, animal and plant life, incinerated it, and took it up in that fireball. The blast actually had more heat and more light than the sun. So it incinerated everything and took it up in the fireball that rained down radioactive ash for days. And it created an element all of its own called trinitite, the only place in the world where trinitite exists. And that was because we have so much sand in our soil here, and it melted the sand, joined it with the plutonium and other radioactive isotopes, and turned it into this green glass-like substance that coated the desert floor and in the area around Trinity. That type of an explosion created massive fallout, but almost no destruction. And what they learned was that in going to Japan, they couldn't detonate a bomb at 100 feet off the ground. And so they detonated the bombs at 1,600 and 1,800 feet respectively to create massive destruction and less fallout. So the people of New Mexico were subject to great amounts of fallout. It was our rainy season. We had no running water. We depended on the rain that fell from the sky. We collected it in cisterns and holding ponds and in our irrigation ditches or acequias. And that's the water that we used for drinking and cooking and bathing and cleaning. And now our complete water supply was destroyed. We also didn't have refrigeration because we didn't have electricity. Electricity wasn't widely available in New Mexico in 1945. So everything that we ate, all the meat, the dairy, the produce, that was all produced by us, by our own hands, at our own homes, on our own farms, in our own gardens. And it would have been the peak of the harvest when women would have been canning and drying as much as they could from their gardens and their orchards for the upcoming winter. All of that too was destroyed. The government never notified anybody before or afterwards to take precautions with how they lived, and we were maximally exposed. Now, the really sad truth of this is that women and children have always been the most affected. And after a 10-year decline in infant mortality all over the country, and specifically in New Mexico because of the advent of antibiotics and better hygienic practices, there was a decline in infant mortality. But in the months just after Trinity, we had these huge spikes in infant mortality. We went from something like 30 babies per thousand to over 100 babies per thousand in the months of August, September, October, November, December. And the reason that happened, and this goes to what Mary Olson talks about all the time, women actually were concentrating the radiation in their mammary glands, and they would have been breastfeeding their babies and poisoning them unbeknownst to them. And health workers in New Mexico did outreach to the Manhattan District Project and said, is there anything you can think of that would help us, because our babies are dying and nothing we can do is saving their lives. And they're dying from a dysentery-like syndrome, which is exactly what would happen if you were overexposed to radiation. And so while these babies' bodies were small, again, think about reference, man. It's based on a male model and a male model of a certain number of pounds. A baby's body wouldn't have been able to withstand the radiation load it received at the time of the test, and then it would have been receiving a radiation load from being breastfed by their mothers. And for me, this is the most heartbreaking part of the story. It's unconscionable that when the government was contacted and they had an opportunity to intercede on behalf of us, human beings, American citizens, men, women, and children, they looked the other way. And women, families were left to wonder what it was that killed their babies. Why were their children dying? Why were their children being born with a multitude of malformations? Women have always borne a lot of what has taken place here with our overexposure to radiation. We seem to have terrible thyroid problems. I had thyroid disease when I was diagnosed with thyroid disease at a very young age. And by the time I was 39, I had thyroid cancer. I'm the fourth generation in my family to have cancer since 1945. In 1955, my two great-grandfathers that lived in Tularosa, 40 miles from the Trinity Test site, were both diagnosed with what they called stomach cancer because no one had ever heard the word cancer before. And there was no treatment for them. They gave them morphine and they sent them home to die, and it was horrific what they endured. My two grandmothers both had cancer. They didn't lose their lives from the cancer, but they both had cancer. And then my father, who was a 4-year-old child, and his only risk factor was being a downwinder in a downwind community, being raised, drinking fresh milk. My family members have told me, your dad didn't drink glasses of milk, he drank gallons of milk. My father got oral cancer. They had to remove part of his tongue at the base of his tongue. He had to go through months of radiation. He was on a feeding tube for over 100. I mean, my father was on a feeding tube for over 18 months. He lost over 60 pounds. My father went from being this very strong, capable man to being reduced to weighing about 140. And he lived through it. We were so grateful and certainly shocked that he lived through it. And then he got prostate cancer, which we always said was a walk in the park compared to what he had already been through. And then 8 years after his first cancer, he got cancer at the front of his mouth. And my dad just couldn't withstand what he went through the second time, and he lost his battle with cancer. And we've forever been left with PTSD that we suffered because the unfortunate thing is the people of New Mexico have never been included in what's called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. And we're left here on our own to deal with all of these health tragedies. And there has never been any option for us to generate generational wealth, for us to develop generational wealth, because we spend all we have taking care of our health. New Mexico has the highest number of people per capita utilizing Medicaid to access healthcare. 47% of the people here use Medicaid to access healthcare. This issue has robbed us of our ability to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. I always tell people, we don't ask ourselves if we're going to get cancer. We ask ourselves when it's going to happen, because it's happened to everyone around us. We bury somebody and someone else is diagnosed. My 81-year-old aunt, my dad's oldest sister, just finished radiation treatment for breast cancer. And I spoke to her last week and I was just blown away because I think no 81-year-old lady should have to go through this right now. She told me, Tina, it took everything I had to go that last week because I was so burned. My chest was so burned from the radiation. And so what can you do? What can people do? Well, very soon, bills are going to be introduced in Congress to amend the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act has been available to downwinders from other states for 31 years. And us, the people first exposed to radiation any place in the world, have never been included. The bill will sunset in 2022, July 2022. If we don't get this done now, it's never going to happen. It will never happen for us. Not only will it take care of the downwinders from New Mexico, it will also take care of the post-71 uranium miners, which we have an enormous number of those in New Mexico too. And I'm certain Leona will talk about that when she gets her opportunity. So please, we need people from all across the United States to lobby with us to get these bills passed as soon as they're introduced. I will put our website in the chat. I expect that as soon as Congress gets back from their recess, the bills will be introduced. We need every vote in the Senate and we need everybody to weigh in. If you remain complacent as it relates to this issue, it makes you complicit. You have to join with us to make sure these bills get passed before they sunset. I will look forward to answering any questions anyone has when the time comes for questions. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate.
Wow, well, thank you, Tina. I remember first hearing your story, I think it was 4 years ago at the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability in Washington, D.C., which, by the way, is a really key place to meet all the people like Tina who have lived near nuclear sites or factories or bombings. And you were so passionate then and you are so passionate now. So thank you so much for your presentation. And there'll be questions afterwards, I'm sure. So now I'd like to introduce Leona Morgan. She is an indigenous community organizer amongst the Navajo people and was born and raised in, you know, what you need to think of as the belly of the beast, namely the nuclear beast, the state of New Mexico, where uranium is mined, refined, stored, and buried. Her people deal with the beginning and the end of the uranium fuel cycle, namely the people who deal with the mining of it, and then at the end, the transport and storage of the nuclear waste material. And of course, between those two stages, the bombs are created and do nothing to help the people of New Mexico or America or the world. So Leona, you're welcome to speak now.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to introduce myself traditionally, the way our people do by our clans. Leona Morgan, thank you for having me here today. I'm really happy to share information about all of these horrible issues, and I just want to highlight, I often run out of time telling these horror stories and forget to tell people about all the victories and the good news, because there are victories and there is a lot of work like Tina mentioned, and there's a lot of opportunity for people to do your 2 cents and support many of the nuclear issues across the country. So I'm going to share my screen. And I'm just going to, I have some slides, but I'm going to start with just sharing a Google map just to orient all of us. So this is New Mexico. And if we can just focus on this state here, all of these tags I got on the Google map are nuclear sites in New Mexico. And you can see up in the the northwest, this is where my people are from. So I'm Diné, and our people are traditionally from the 4 Sacred Mountains, which is like this whole region. And then I'm in Albuquerque right now on Tiwa lands, so I'm on Pueblo land. But I'm going to talk mostly about this corner of the state, and then I'm going to switch to this corner of the state, which is the southeastern part of the state. And Tina was mentioning the Trinity site, which is right in the middle. And we have another excellent map, which I will share in the chat. I don't know if I have it open here. Yeah, I do. Okay, so this is called a sacred trust map, and then you can see if you zoom in, it's a small map, and you have to look very closely at it. But this is zoomed into the southeastern part of the state. But if I go back, there's two maps, and I'll share these both in the chat. But I think these are really good tools to highlight what Tina and I are talking about. So here's the Trinity site, and you can see the fallout how it traveled to the northeast. Here's Los Alamos, and then that was some of the emissions from the fire that occurred about 20 years ago. So again, I'm going to focus on the uranium area here, and then this corner of the state here. So the main topics that I want to focus on are nuclear colonialism. And so as an Indigenous person, we're still here. There's over 570 federally recognized tribes in the US and hundreds more in Canada. So we call North America Turtle Island, and there's literally thousands of Indigenous people still here all throughout Turtle Island, North America, and then of course South America. And a lot of people think that colonization is something that is part of history. It really wasn't taught in our US history classes, and most of this wasn't. And so I'm really glad for your program here and for people like you being involved, because this is how we really get the real information out there. So nuclear colonialism, and you can read the definition there, but it's basically the ongoing theft of our Mother Earth, our lands, but also the continued tools of racism and exploitation. Today, it's not just stealing our land and killing our people through different forms of genocide, but it's also the theft of our future, taking away clean drinking water, contaminating and poisoning our air and that kind of thing. So the presentation I'm going to focus on, I'm going to talk a lot about things happening on Navajo Nation, but also things in New Mexico in general across the country. So the first major thing to know, I'm really glad the presentation started out with a description about uranium, so I don't have to talk about it. And something that people maybe are confused about, especially some environmentalists, they think that nuclear energy or nuclear power is clean or could be the solution to climate change, which it is not. And I'll tell you why. So if you look at this, this is an infographic of a nuclear energy development. It doesn't have the weapons side. We're working on that. So a friend of mine, Yuko Tonihira from Japan, she lives in Brooklyn. She's an amazing graphic artist. She designed this to show at every stage from uranium exploration and all of the different steps of processing, you can see that waste is created. And so that goes into, our environment, our water, it affects our health and all of the things that are going on that we're talking about today. So this is the energy side. And when we talk about the carbon output or the carbon footprint of nuclear energy, it is only calculated here at this one stage, which is the nuclear power plant. So they count the construction, the operation, and then the decommissioning, but they don't count all of the processes before, any of the transportation, the waste management, and of course the issue of high-level radioactive waste that will be radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years. And this is really an international problem. What do we do with this waste? So put it in New Mexico is what they're saying. And I'll get to that toward the end of my presentation. So I want to start, okay, let's go back here real quickly. So just to remind you, right here is where they count the carbon footprint of the whole nuclear fuel chain. And these steps here, I'm going to focus on next. And most of these can be found in New Mexico. If not now, there's also proposals for future projects to come here. So new nuclear, and all of this is part of some of the infrastructure bill that just passed and some of Biden's work. And so we really need to keep track of what's going on in Washington, because they're putting a lot of money toward bailouts and new nuclear, which they call small modular nuclear reactors. And they say, oh, those are different. They're going to be the future source of energy. They don't make weight. You know, there's all these big pie in the sky, dreams that they're thinking that nuclear energy is going to fix. But it's basically going to result in similar stuff that we've already seen, such as resource colonialism. So I'm just trying to broaden the picture, because on Navajo Nation, which I'm going to talk about the uranium impact, we have been mostly impacted by resource colonialism since the Navajo Nation started. And the Navajo Nation was actually created in order to sign leases with coal companies. And so this is part of that colonization. And so all of these places, you can see these generating stations that created this methane spot across the country. So this is one of the coal-fired power plants, and you can see all of the coal mines. And so right now, these are beginning to shut down and transition. And something I wanted to highlight, the reason I bring this up is because when we talk about transitioning, nuclear is not the solution to climate change. But when we start saying like renewables, and we're talking about batteries and all of those other types of things that we'll need, those also require extraction. So I want to remind people to keep in mind the extraction part of lithium, cobalt, and copper, and some of those other things that impact Indigenous peoples in Canada, Africa, and different places. And so this is one of the reasons why our nation was hit really hard with COVID. A few years ago, there was a big chemical fire at several fracking sites. You can look at this picture, and it didn't really make mainstream news. So we have a lot of energy production on the Navajo Nation that is exported, but not a lot of it stays. And about 30% of our people, the statistics change between 20 and 30% of our people don't have access to drinking water within the home. So there's no running water, and some people still have no electricity. And can you imagine with all of that energy going out? And so right now we're dealing with this is showing the abandoned uranium mines in the country. So again, abandoned uranium mines, both energy and weapons. The uranium boom was about from the 50s to the 80s. A lot of the mines shut down in the 80s. There's still mining up in like the Great Plains and Black Hills area. None in New Mexico at the time. Navajo Nation has a law against uranium mining since 2005, and also a law against transport of radioactive materials. And so this map shows that the EPA counts about 15,000 abandoned uranium mines, which is the number we use. However, the DOE claims about a little over 4,000 that were for the weapons. This is one of the more current maps of the Navajo Nation uranium cleanup. So across the country, all of those abandoned uranium mines, there's no law saying to clean them up. So in addition to issues with RECA and things that are not there, like money for our human beings who mine uranium, people who suffered from the use of weapons, and then also the environment, and now we're looking at cleanup of over 15,000 abandoned uranium mines. There's no money for that in Congress, and we really need to push Congress to focus on cleaning up all of the abandoned uranium mines, not just on Navajo, because that's a lot of contaminated water across the country that we're really going to need this in the future. And we're seeing all of the impacts from climate change happening. And so we need to tell all of the elected officials across the board, we don't need new nuclear energy. We don't need new nuclear weapons. We need to focus on cleaning up the abandoned uranium mines and extending RECA and funding that. So if you can look at the map, I'm trying to juxtapose how the EPA makes this really pretty kind of picture. But this is one of the maps done by researchers on our side, so more like activists. And they show also the mill sites, which are where the uranium is processed. And those are very highly contaminated areas. There's only one active uranium mill in the country here in Southeast Utah. And that's also, there's a lot of issues with that. And so I really want to go through some of these in detail, but I don't have the time. And so if you have any questions, I can elaborate either on the White Mesa Mill. This is the Church Rock site. This is one of the most contaminated places in the country. And Tina was talking about the use of the first nuclear weapon on July 16th. Well, this was around about the exact same time and day 5:30 in the morning, July 16th. But in 1979, there was a pond, a waste pond that was holding radioactive waste, and it broke in the early morning, and all that radioactive waste spilled out from here. This is the site, and then it went into it got into this ditch and then reached the Puerco River. Not the real Puerco, the Puerco River, that's another river. Then that went into Arizona about 100 miles. This has never been cleaned up or fully studied. There's still cleanup happening in the area around the homes of this community, which lives between 3 abandoned uranium mines and a uranium mill. So they're going through cleanup now. And this is the proposal for cleanup. It's horrible. And there's an open comment period if anyone wants to send a letter to the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They want to clean up the site by taking the mine waste from here and piling it on top of where the mill waste spilled on July 16th, 1979. And the community is saying, this is all a floodplain. We already saw what happened the last time there was an accident. What happens the next time? And so the community, just like Tina said, is not saying if, but when. And so we know that uranium, we've already lived it. We have the experience of all the contamination to our sacred places, our resources, our human health. And so I'm just going to finish by showing the map with the proposals for 2 nuclear waste sites in New Mexico. So this is where they took out the uranium, mostly in the west. And then if you look at this map, this is where the energy from nuclear was used, and it was mostly in the east, but all of the development happened across the country, so the processing. So if you overlap those maps, you can see the uranium came out of that part of the country, and mostly the East Coast mostly benefited, but there's no nuclear power plants where the uranium came from. And now, I gotta go forward a little bit. I'm sorry, my slide is, now they wanna put the waste from all of the power plants back in New Mexico. Now we call this environmental racism. They took the energy, they took the weapons, they used it for United States imperialism and, military, economy, energy, all of that. And now they're trying to move the waste back to us. The 2 proposals are moving forward, and we're expecting a decision. We're expecting the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to approve both of them, one late this year and one early next year. So now these are the big fights. We have radioactive waste from uranium mining and now radioactive waste from nuclear power plants. I have a lot more to share, but I'm going to stop there. The last thing on this map, it just shows where those 2 waste sites are that are being proposed right here and right here. They're 40 miles apart. And this one, Holtec, is only 13 miles from WILPF. And WILPF is also planning to go through expansions. They want to expand the size, the types of waste, because this is mostly weapons waste, but they want to add different types of waste, and they want to get bigger. And then they also want to take away their closure date of 2024 and make it open forever. So this has implications with Los Alamos and all of the other national facilities around the country. I think this would be a really good place for WILPF to interact and get engaged in helping to support some of these fights against the growing military industrial complex. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you. That was extraordinary. And your knowledge and following all of this, and the maps especially, is helping us to understand this. And so I live in Vermont, and we had Vermont Yankee, and we had a whole campaign to close Vermont Yankee. And I hope there are a few people on the call who might be chiming in here. We managed to close it, but now we have to deal with the waste. And our senators, I believe both our senators are in agreement that the waste should not be transported. It should be dealt with online by Holtec, I believe, which of course there's lots of questions about that. So I think there'll be more questions for you later, but let me just bring in our last speaker, Helen Jacquard, Raising the Sail to Raise Awareness. I love her project. Her primary focus is to bring about an end to all aspects of the nuclear era. She has been project manager of the Veterans for Peace anti-nuclear sailboat, the Golden Rule. What a wonderful name for stopping the destruction of indigenous people around the world from the test sites. The Golden Rule. The Golden Rule first set sail in 1958 to try to stop nuclear testing in the Pacific. Veterans for Peace recovered and restored the original peace boat, which has inspired many peacemakers since then and inspired peace ships as well. So Helen, please tell us what's happening now with the Golden Rule. There it is.
Okay, hi.
Beautiful.
Welcome, and thank you very much for having me here today, and thank you for all the participants that are here. Yes, Robin did a great job of explaining what's going on with the Golden Rule in the past. You know, this webinar we're in right now, Uniting Communities for Environmental Justice, Radioactive Pollution, Deadly in Any Space. Well, that fits right in with the Golden Rule Project's mission to educate about the dangers of radiation to humanity and the environment. So we're right there with you as far as what we've been doing all along since the boat was rebuilt. And as you said, in 1958, the mission was to stop nuclear weapons tests. 4 peace activists sailed this boat in an attempt to get to the Marshall Islands and just put themselves in the way of nuclear bomb tests. And they made it to Honolulu. They resupplied. They were headed for the Marshall Islands, and they were arrested. And you know, this is a big success story in my opinion, because the arrest of the crew of the Golden Rule brought protests that ultimately led to a big movement such that Kennedy could sign the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty, and it did inspire Greenpeace and other activities by boat since then. The boat was disappeared, was floating around in Humboldt Bay in 2010, and she sank in a gale after bashing against a dock. And Veterans for Peace and Quakers and even some WILPF members got together to restore her. And the story of that is on our website, vfpgoldenrule.org. The movie is Making Waves, Rebirth of the Golden Rule. So from 2015, when we relaunched, to mid-2019, we went all over the waters of the West Coast, doing protests, but mostly doing educational events. Our objective is to reach a broad audience, not just peace activists. We do inspire the anti-nuclear movement and the peace movement and the environmental movement, but we need to reach everyone. In 2017, Donald Trump started threatening North Korea and other nations with nuclear annihilation, and Golden Rule Committee decided to take the Golden Rule back to the Pacific to try to raise awareness of the dangers of nuclear war. So again, we went to Hawaii on our way to the Marshall Islands. And we were going to head on to Guam, Okinawa, and be in Japan in time for the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the bombs. COVID got in our way, but we spent 22 months in the Hawaiian Islands, all over everywhere we could go except Niihau.
Okay, we only have.
So we repeated the voyage before. Oh, thank you.
We only have a few more minutes for this segment. Thank you. Keep going.
Okay. Okay. So we just made it back to California from Hawaii, and our next trip is going to be the Great Loop, and this will cover all the rest of the waterways of the United States, down the Mississippi River, around Florida, up to New England, all over the Great Lakes and back to the Gulf of Mexico, and then probably through the Panama Canal and back to California. This will be a 15-month voyage up until we start towards the Panama Canal, and we'll visit over 100 cities. Hope to see a lot of you there. We were going to leave in September this year, and we had to delay because we don't have sufficient infrastructure, the money, the staff, and the volunteers to make the best of this possibility. And COVID and the drought have also given us some concern. So we're delaying for exactly a year is our plan. While we're delaying, in order to improve our infrastructure, we're looking for organizational partners. And I'm hoping WILPF will become one of our partners because we need help to organize events, including publicity, getting your own members out there, giving speakers like we've got today, having a literature table, providing volunteers, and we need funds, of course. We're hoping our partners will help either contribute funds or help us raise the funds needed for this big voyage. In order to keep a well-organized staff, I have put together a list of roles and descriptions of what people need to do in order to do this right. And so you can contact me at vfpgoldenruleproject@gmail.com or my phone number. All of this is available on vfpgoldenrule.org. Ellen Thomas asked me just to briefly mention that Veterans for Peace has also started a nuclear abolition working group. And we are on board with, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, all of the back from the brink measures, and other things that we know are necessary to end the whole nuclear era, including, nuclear energy and uranium mining, get all of that cleaned up, get the people compensated, and, just wanting you guys to know that we are now meeting every other week and inviting people to present and talk with us, and then we're in turn talking with other groups. So,
but just one other idea I want to bring up, and that is that with all of this nuclear waste and contamination and the mines and the bomb testing sites, apparently there are power plants around 30 countries, and it's going to remain contaminated for tens or even thousands of years. On top of that, the United States plans to spend up to $1.5 trillion to overhaul the nuclear arsenal by rebuilding each leg of the nuclear triangle, submarines, bombers, and missiles, creating more nuclear waste with no long-term solution. And by the way, reading this book was quite fascinating for me in getting going in on this discussion. I don't know whether that's backwards or not. So one of the ideas to deal with this, to deal with the disaster of this waste around our country, we need to start asking questions and making plans. Because there's going to be disruption, resources will contract, coastlines will be flooded. And so I just like to bring up the ideas of Joanna Macy, an eco-philosopher. Some of you may know of her. She lives out west, has developed the idea of nuclear guardianship. A concept created to care for the radioactive legacy that we are bequeathing to future generations. Here is a photo of the barrels at Rocky Flats, for example. She proposes to keep the material, the waste, visible above ground, which would further serve to develop people's commitment to its responsible care. This should be recognized as humanity's most enduring artifact for future generations. In order to care, we must pay attention. So I think that's an appalling idea that radioactive waste is our most enduring artifact. It's sort of what we are handing to the next generation. So with that, I'd like to invite questions, or Ellen, are you able to help me a bit with that?
There's a question for Helen. How long is the Golden Rule going to be in Berkeley? And can people go out on it?
Okay, yes, you're going to have to contact me by email. So what's going on with that is that we'll be there for another week or two. Then we're going to go up to Humboldt Bay. Then we may go down to San Diego and back. but pretty reliably will be there during the winter and the spring and the summer, or at least somewhere along the West Coast. So you'll just have to, things are in flux right now because we need to do some maintenance.
Saying.
I see a question I can answer quickly that about the abandoned uranium mines from Paula. So I didn't say this part, which is really important, and thank you for asking the question. I was referring to abandoned uranium mines, which were mines that were created before laws were in place to clean them up. And so because there was no laws back when there was the uranium boom, and the uranium boom again from the 50s to the 80s, that was mostly before the EPA existed, because that didn't start till the 70s. And so what you said in the chat is pretty much correct. It's really hard to get different corporations to be responsible. And a lot of them, they just set up temporary companies and then they shut down. So to detach themselves, exactly like you said. And this is why it's necessary for the United States to be named the responsible party. So if anyone wants an easy talking point, the United States should stop funding bombs and nuclear energy until it takes full responsibility for all of the mess it's cleaned up, from uranium mining, testing, and then our human health. I mean, that's the easiest thing to say.
If I could just add something to what Leona said. The post-71 uranium miners exist because in 1971, uranium became commercially available, and the government said, we're not going to take responsibility for people's health any longer because industry will do that. And we all know what happens with industry. They do exactly what Paula outlined. They just file bankruptcy or they tie it up in court for eternity. But something really amazing happened when I testified in March in Congress about RECA amendments. Congressman Johnson, Representative Johnson from Georgia, said something very impactful. He said, you know, we spend $500 billion every 10 years guarding our nuclear arsenal. That's $50 billion a year. And we've paid out $3.2 billion through RECA over 31 years. He says that's a pittance. And he's absolutely right. And we can no longer accept the idea that our government doesn't have the money for taking care of the people that were harmed and cleaning up the messes that they made. You know, people, indigenous people, people of color like Leona and I have always been the people most affected by this. And so we need everyone's help. We need everybody to join us in this fight.